The girls expected to be dragged. Instead, he tipped his hat. In the sweltering Philippine heat of 1945, a group of Japanese comfort girls, young women captured near the front, stood lined up in silence, their faces hardened by fear. Most had been taken from their homes, their identities erased, reduced to tools for the Empire's war machine. Now they waited for punishment, humiliation, or worse. Instead, an American soldier stepped forward, a tall, drawling man with boots caked in dust and a Stetson cocked low on his brow. He didn't yell, he didn't leer. He simply pulled a cigarette from his coat, placed it between his lips, then looked at the women and asked, almost casually, "Can any of you ride a horse?" The girls froze. One blinked. Another laughed, softly, unsure if it was a joke. But the man was dead serious, and that single strange demand, delivered in a language few understood, would unravel everything they'd been told about war, honor, and themselves. They had names once: daughters, sisters, schoolgirls, villagers. But by the time the Japanese military carted them to the edges of the Pacific, those names had dissolved into something else entirely. The Army didn't want identities, it wanted instruments, and so the comfort girls became shadows, silent and obedient, their pasts erased by bureaucracy and brutality. Each wore the same blank expression, not from numbness, but from necessity. Survival in the comfort stations meant knowing when to speak, when to disappear, and how to endure hours that bled into one another without mercy. They were told it was for the Empire, that this was sacrifice. But even sacrifice demands consent. What they endured was possession. The stations smelled of sweat, blood, and antiseptic. Their beds, if they could be called that, were straw mats or bare wood. Some bled for days without medical care. Some never stopped bleeding. Discipline came in the form of shouted orders, fists, and silence. There were no names, only ranks. No families, only rotation schedules. If one girl broke, another replaced her by dusk. When American forces drew closer to the Philippines in early 1945, whispers of retreat trickled in. But the officers didn't announce it. They simply left. One morning, a group of women woke to find the soldiers gone. Uniforms were discarded in piles, rifles abandoned like forgotten toys. For a moment, the girls thought it was a trap. Then reality set in. They had been discarded, left behind like broken tools. Some wept, others simply sat. The silence felt more dangerous than gunfire. It was not long before the Americans came. When the boots arrived, not the brutal thunder they had feared, but a slow, cautious approach. The women braced. They had no idea what would happen. Their training, if it could be called that, had been clear. Surrender was worse than death. American soldiers were devils, rapists, monsters. It was better to bite your tongue off than fall into their hands. That's what the officers had said, often while pulling up their own pants, wiping their mouths, and walking out of the room without looking back. When the Americans entered the compound, rifles drawn, the women dropped to their knees. Some cried. Some stared blankly ahead, ready to be struck. But no blow came. Instead, the soldiers lowered their guns. One handed a woman a tin of water. Another tossed a pack of cigarettes onto the ground. The language barrier was complete, but there was something unmistakable in the air. Hesitation, maybe even shame. The women waited. A few backed away, expecting the worst. But nothing happened. One soldier radioed in coordinates. Another took off his helmet and knelt beside a wounded girl, inspecting her leg. The sun beat down, unrelenting, but no command to move came. Only quiet movement, water, murmured confusion. At night, as the women huddled in the remains of their barracks, They whispered to one another in disbelief. "Is this a trick?" someone asked. "Are they waiting for us to sleep?" Their bodies knew terror better than rest. They took turns keeping watch. One tried to run that night, not to escape, but to die before morning. She was stopped by another girl, arms wrapped tight around her waist, whispering, "Not yet, not yet." They had survived the Empire's cruelty. Could they survive its unraveling? Still, the fear clung to them like smoke. Each act of mercy, a bandage, a meal, a gesture, only deepened the suspicion. Kindness felt like bait. That's what war does. It rewires the mind until even compassion seems like a prelude to horror. They were not ready for gentleness. They had not been trained for it. And when the cowboy showed up, boots scuffed, hat tilted, drawl thick as molasses, they were sure the other shoe would drop. But it didn't. Instead, he pointed toward a corral, squinted, and asked the question that would change everything. "Can any of y'all ride?" No one answered. Not at first. The words, thick with an unfamiliar accent, hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. The cowboy stood just beyond the wire, arms relaxed at his sides, hat tipped against the sun. His presence made no sense. The women had expected soldiers in pressed uniforms barking orders, not this tall, sunburned man in scuffed boots and a shirt rolled to the elbows, with dust on his collar and a frayed bandana tucked into his pocket like a flag of some lost republic. He looked more like a ranch hand than a warrior, but the pistol at his hip said otherwise. His name was Sergeant Roy Callahan. Born in the dry hills outside of Amarillo, Texas, he had grown up on a cattle ranch, learning to ride before he could spell his own name. The war had yanked him from open fields and dropped him into hell, first in the Pacific, then on cleanup duty in post-capture territories. He had seen enough blood to know that sometimes a man fought better with patience than bullets. When he was assigned to help secure a women's internment facility, most of the other men laughed. But Callahan had volunteered. "I've wrangled steers with more sense than some of our brass," he muttered. "Figure I can handle a few scared gals with no one left to fight for." The women didn't know what to make of him. The other Americans kept to protocol, rifles slung, voices clipped. They patrolled with the wary posture of men expecting sabotage. But not Callahan. He strolled the perimeter slow and steady, like a man checking fence posts. Sometimes he whistled, sometimes he just stood, arms crossed, watching the clouds with the expression of someone thinking about chores back home. And then he brought the horses. They came one morning, delivered in a rattling truck from another camp. 4 wiry animals, all ribs and nervous eyes. One was a gray mare with a limp. Another had a wild streak in her that flared whenever a hand got too close. The girls watched from the barracks as the cowboy stepped into the makeshift corral and ran his palm along the gray mare's neck, whispering something low. The animal calmed almost instantly. That, more than any kindness, unnerved the women. If he could tame a horse like that, what could he do to them? When he turned and asked again, slower this time, pointing to the saddle, "Ride, do any of you ride?" It felt like a trick, a test. One girl whispered, "He wants to humiliate us." Another said, "They will tie us up, make us perform." But no order came. Just that same soft drawl, patient and peculiar, as though he were asking who knew how to bake bread. Finally, one woman stepped forward. Her name was Aki. She had been a farm girl once, long before the war swallowed her name. She lifted her chin and mimed a riding motion, uncertain. The cowboy's face lit up with something close to relief. He beckoned gently, then held the reins out to her like an offering. When she approached, her steps stiff with fear, he didn't move, just waited. She touched the saddle, flinched, and still he didn't force her. Slowly she mounted. It was awkward, halting. She didn't remember much from childhood, only how her uncle once led her around a field on a tired mule. But the horse beneath her now shifted obediently. The barracks had gone silent. Dozens of eyes watched as Aki, back straight, let the horse take 2 steps forward. The cowboy clapped once, a small smile breaking across his sunburned face. He tipped his hat. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "Y'all are full of surprises." The girls didn't cheer, they didn't laugh, but something cracked in the silence. For the first time since their capture, the air held something other than fear. They hadn't been forced, they hadn't been shamed, they had been asked. It made no sense, and it scared them more than the rifles ever had. They followed him the next morning, still unsure if it was real. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the dew on the grass clung to their bare ankles as they shuffled in loose lines behind Sergeant Callahan. He walked ahead without turning back, a coil of rope in one hand, a tin cup of coffee in the other, as though he were headed to a lazy morning on the ranch. When they reached the far end of the compound, the wire gave way to something else. A fenced-off patch of land, rickety and uneven, but unmistakably a corral. Horses paced the enclosure, flicking their tails, their hides glinting gold in the morning light. And then there was the smell, sharp and alive, sweat, hay, old leather, and something else that stirred memory before thought. The women stood at the edge, confused. Was this a trick? A punishment? But the cowboy said nothing cruel. Instead, he looped the rope over a post, took a sip from his tin, and said quietly, "Back home, we start our day with chores. Animals don't care who you are, only how you treat 'em." Then he opened the gate and walked inside. The horses didn't scatter. They watched him with sleepy, flicking ears, like they recognized something. That first day, only Aki rode. The others stayed behind the fence, arms crossed, muscles tense. Callahan didn't push them. He showed Aki how to guide the horse gently, how not to grip too tight, how to lean with the animal instead of against it. She didn't speak English, but she understood enough through gesture and repetition. When she dismounted, dusty, bruised, her face flushed, she didn't smile, but something in her eyes flickered. It was not pride, not exactly. More like permission. The next day, another joined. Then another. Soon, a small group of women began meeting Callahan each morning at the fence line. He brought extra brushes, saddles, a bucket of apples. The horses were stubborn. They nipped. They startled at shadows. One kicked over a water pail, sending a girl sprawling. The women learned quickly. Animals were honest. They did not respond to fear or submission, only presence. It was exhausting, and yet it felt different from everything else. Each bruise came with a strange satisfaction. Each small success, a clean trot, a smooth turn, felt like something earned. Callahan never raised his voice. When a horse bucked, he stepped in calm. When one girl dropped the reins and burst into tears, he offered her a handkerchief and walked her back without a word. "Riding ain't about control," he told them one morning, adjusting a stirrup. "It's about balance. If you can sit a horse, you can stand taller everywhere else." They didn't understand his words, not exactly, but the tone, the steadiness, that they understood. The horses began to change, too. Their ribs softened with better feed. Their eyes grew brighter. The women named them, secretly, in their own language. Kumo, for the one with cloudy eyes. Uta, for the mare who seemed to hum when brushed. They sang to them under their breath, old lullabies and broken childhood rhymes. The act of brushing a mane, of wrapping a wound on a hoof, of feeling a warm flank rise and fall beneath their palm. These things called back parts of themselves they thought had been lost. No man in uniform had ever looked at them like Callahan did when he passed the reins. Not as property, not as shame, but as someone worth trusting. It was terrifying. And in some quiet, wordless way, it was the beginning of healing. One morning, as the sun broke pink across the camp, Aki mounted without instruction. The saddle creaked, the horse snorted, and then they moved, slow and steady, across the edge of the world. The others watched in silence, and in that still moment, filled with the smell of saddle leather and dust, something ancient stirred. Not power, not victory, just the fragile shape of freedom. It began with a clipboard and a stack of envelopes. An officer, not Callahan, came to the barracks one morning and announced, through a translator, that the women would be permitted to write letters home. At first, there was silence. The women looked at one another, unsure if they had heard correctly. Letters? To where? To whom? Many had no idea if their families were still alive. Some had not seen a familiar face in years. The idea of a message making it through the wreckage of war felt like fantasy. Others didn't believe it at all. "They will read it," one woman whispered. "They will laugh at us." Another shook her head. "This is a test. If we write the wrong thing, we will be punished." No one moved. But the paper came anyway. Small sheets, lined and folded, pencils, freshly sharpened, passed out like relics from another world. Callahan watched from a distance. He didn't speak. He only leaned against a post, arms crossed, gaze steady, as the women stared down at the empty page in front of them. Blank paper had never looked so heavy. For many, the first words came slowly, scratched hesitantly, like walking barefoot over broken glass. What could they say? That they were alive? That they rode horses now? That a cowboy handed them reins instead of commands? Some began with formal greetings. Others simply wrote a name, mother, sister, Hiroko, and then paused, the pencil hovering. Aki wrote, "I am alive. There is food. We ride horses in the morning. I do not understand this place." Another girl, barely 18, wrote, "They gave me a blanket with no holes. They let us touch the animals." One smiled at me. An American smiled. "I am not sure what this means. They were told not to write anything political, not to ask questions about the war. All letters would be read and approved before being sent." But even within those rules, the truth seeped through, not in grand declarations, but in details so small they slipped past the censors like water through a crack. "The bread is warm," one woman wrote. "The guards are quiet. No one has struck us. I feel confused." Another mentioned the soap. "Real soap, fragrant and soft. It smells like flowers," she scribbled, "and I don't know why that made me cry." The letters passed through layers of bureaucracy. First American censors, who removed nothing, and then Japanese intelligence, who read them with growing discomfort. What they found were not reports of torture or starvation. There were no pleas for rescue, no cries of hatred. Instead, they read about horses, blankets, food, a girl who said she laughed when she fell from a saddle and the cowboy only chuckled and helped her up. These were not the words of broken prisoners. They were something else, something dangerous. Because if these girls could find kindness in captivity, what did that say about the empire that had abandoned them? Back in Tokyo, officials were furious. Some letters were intercepted and destroyed. Others were stored as classified material, buried in government archives. A few were leaked, whispered among families who didn't know whether to believe what they read. One mother, upon receiving a note from her daughter, wept for hours. "She says they feed her," she murmured. "They feed her." Inside the camp, the act of writing became a ritual. The women began to wait for paper like they once waited for rationed rice. Callahan, when asked why he allowed it, shrugged. "Ain't a crime to write home," he said. "Might even be medicine." He was right. Each letter, however small, however censored, became a fracture in the wall the war had built between who they had been and who they were becoming. They were still prisoners, but now they were also correspondents, witnesses, and in the quiet scrawl of pencil on paper they told the world a truth too strange to be fiction, that sometimes, even in a war built on silence, someone listens. But listening is a dangerous thing, especially when the voice you begin to hear is your own. The women had been trained not just to obey, but to believe that their obedience was sacred. They were not supposed to want comfort. Hunger was proof of loyalty. Pain was the tax of honor. And yet, every morning they were handed apples. Every evening, a warm blanket. No sermon, no command, no flag overhead. Just quiet acts of care. And these small mercies felt like betrayals. They didn't accept them easily. The brush strokes on a horse's mane, the soft feel of clean clothes, even the way the wind moved freely through the corral. All of it made them uneasy. They would sneak food back to the barracks, half expecting it to be poisoned. Some hid their blankets and slept on bare boards out of habit. Others avoided Callahan's gaze, afraid that eye contact might bring shame. They washed quickly, mechanically, refusing to enjoy the clean water. Even laughter, when it came, arrived like a mistake. One girl, after tripping and laughing at herself during a riding lesson, immediately slapped her own cheek. "I forgot myself," she whispered. "I'm sorry." But forgetting, or rather remembering something deeper, had already begun. The rituals of shame, once instinctive, began to crack. The body, it turns out, remembers dignity even when the mind has been taught to reject it. The daily rhythm of feeding horses, writing letters, folding clean clothes, these things created space for something subversive, stillness. And in that stillness, questions emerged. Why were they given books? Why did no one hit them when they made mistakes? Why was a man with a gun offering them saddle lessons instead of orders? None of it aligned with what they had been told. The Americans were supposed to be beasts. Instead, they were farmers, mechanics, translators, cooks. One woman, after being offered seconds at lunch, stared at her bowl as if it were an altar. "Is this a mistake?" she asked. No one answered, but she ate anyway. The erosion of ideology is not loud. It does not come in speeches or sudden awakenings. It comes in routines, in the quiet moment when a girl realizes she no longer flinches at a soldier's shadow, in the gentle way a horse nuzzles her hand, in the act of sewing a torn dress not out of regulation, but pride. These changes were not obvious, not even to them, but they were happening, and with them came guilt. They had not renounced the emperor. They still bowed when speaking his name, but a fracture had opened, a hairline crack between what they were taught and what they were living. One woman began skipping the morning salute. Another stopped folding her clothes in military corners. Aki, once the most devout, now lingered in the stables long after chores were done, whispering stories to Uta, her favorite mare. When asked what she was saying, she only smiled. "I'm remembering who I was." But not everyone welcomed the change. Some feared it. A girl named Emiko wept alone after a riding session, gripping a strip of cloth bearing the imperial sun. "My brother died for this," she said. "If he saw me now—" Another woman, her face hard, replied softly, "He died for a lie. We're still alive. That's the difference." There were no arrests, no punishments. The Americans didn't seem to notice, but inside the barracks a storm was brewing, not of violence, but identity. They had been told they were tools, but now, in the silence between chores, they were beginning to suspect they were human. And that was the most dangerous thought of all. The danger was not in guns or guards or barbed wire. It was in a sound none of them had expected to hear again in this lifetime: laughter. It arrived quietly, like a stray leaf carried on the wind, almost timid in its approach. One morning, just after sunrise, a woman named Haru was tasked with filling a bucket at the pump near the stables. Her hands were still stiff from sleep, her mind wrapped in the familiar fog of dread, when the bucket tilted, slipped, and splashed half its contents across her feet. The shock of cold water made her stumble backward. She flailed, windmilling, and landed square in the mud with a soft thump. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then a tiny snort escaped Aki. It was quick, barely a breath, but unmistakable. The other women stared at her as if she had just blasphemed in front of an altar. Even Aki slapped her own hand across her mouth, horrified at herself. Laughter was dangerous. Joy was indulgence. And yet Haru, dripping and muddy, blinked once, and then began to giggle. The sound wavered, fragile and uncertain, like a string pulled too tight. But it held. It grew. Soon the others joined, quiet at first, then trembling, then fuller, the kind of laughter that comes from remembering you still have a throat. The cowboy arrived midway through the commotion, rope in hand, expecting trouble. Instead, he found half a dozen women doubled over, trying to stifle sounds they had not made since girlhood. He raised one brow, glanced at Haru covered in mud, and let out a low whistle. "Well," he drawled, "reckon somebody lost a fight with the earth." The women didn't understand the words, but the tone, warm, teasing, harmless, made them laugh harder. It was ridiculous. It was forbidden, and it felt like a breath after drowning. But laughter was not the only unexpected visitor inside the camp. Music arrived next. Callahan had a harmonica, old, dented, and slightly out of tune, tucked in the same pocket where he kept extra feed for the horses. One night, as the guards rotated and the women settled into their bunks, he sat on the steps outside the barracks and began to play. The notes drifted through the humid air, slow, nostalgic, something that sounded like a sunset stretched across open plains. The women fell silent. Some lifted their heads, some closed their eyes. None had heard a melody that wasn't a military march in years. The tune was simple, maybe something he learned as a boy sitting beside a campfire. But to the women, it felt like a door cracking open. It didn't matter that they didn't know the words. It didn't matter that the tune bent sharply in the middle, or that he was slightly off-key. Music didn't need translation. It slipped past language and ideology and pain. It touched something raw, something buried, something human. Soon, whenever dusk settled and fireflies flickered at the edge of the compound, the women would sit quietly near the barracks windows, waiting to hear that familiar harmonica hum. Some hummed along without meaning to. Others tapped their fingers against their legs, mimicking beats they didn't truly know. Even the horses quieted during those moments, their ears flicking toward the sound. But if laughter and music were strange gifts, nothing compared to the absurd miracle of the soap. Real soap, not the watery, sand-filled scraps they had been given by Japanese officers, not the bars that crumbled into chalk dust in their hands. This soap was solid, white, smooth, scented faintly with lavender or something else they couldn't name. When the guard in charge of supplies placed a bar into each woman's palm, they reacted as if handed a sacred relic. And then came the washing. The sight of so many women scrubbing themselves clean, real clean, for the first time in years was surreal. They touched their own arms in disbelief, marveling at skin they hadn't seen beneath grime in so long. A few cried silently as the scent rose around them, reminding them of childhood baths, mothers' hands, warm kitchens, innocence. Soap shouldn't have had that power, but it did. Later that night, smelling of lavender and dust and faint horsehair, the women sat together in the dim barracks. Someone giggled, someone hummed the Cowboy's tune, someone held their bar of soap like a charm against nightmares. These moments didn't erase the past. They didn't undo wounds or silence ghosts, but they softened the edges. They reminded the women, gently, quietly, that even in captivity, even in ruins, there existed pieces of life worth holding. A laugh, a song, a clean body, and the fragile courage to believe in all of them again. But when the lights went out, the silence always returned, the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, not from fear, but from the weight of two lives pulling in opposite directions. In the dark, they dreamed of home, of rice paddies swaying in the wind, of mothers kneeling by hearth fires, of childhood games played barefoot in temple courtyards. They woke to the scent of hay and the clink of reins, and between those two worlds they floated, no longer who they were, not yet someone new. They did not belong anywhere, not to the enemy, not even to the empire that had used them and left them behind. They were not honored veterans or remembered victims. They had no medals, no graves, no parades waiting back home. In the space carved out between surrender and survival, they lived like shadows. And yet, here in this strange American place with its foreign smells and its horses and harmonicas, they were being seen. That was both a blessing and a wound, because kindness, when given by an enemy, confuses everything. Cruelty is easy. You know where to place it. You build walls around it. You expect it, prepare for it, harden against it. But when Callahan handed them apples with a smile or laughed softly when they mispronounced English words, something deep inside them twisted. Aki confessed once, in a whisper under her breath, "If he hit me, I would know what to do. But he doesn't." They didn't know how to hate him. They didn't know how not to. The strange part wasn't that he was kind, it was that he didn't seem to want anything in return. Not compliance, not apologies, not submission. He didn't ask them to forget who they were. He only asked if the saddle needed tightening, if they slept well, if the soup was warm enough. And that unspoken message, "You matter, even now," burned hotter than any insult could have. Then came the letters from Japan. Not many made it through, but when they did, the effect was electric. A scribbled note from a father in Osaka, a brief line from a sister in Hiroshima. Some were censored heavily, whole sentences blacked out in thick strokes. Others simply arrived with only a name and a stamp, as if the government itself had approved but refused to speak. And the content, when it was clear, was always the same. Be strong. Do not dishonor yourself. Serve Japan, even now. They read these lines with shaking hands. Some cried, some clenched the paper as if to will it into ash. One girl, Emiko, received a note from her older brother, a soldier presumed dead, urging her to remain pure and silent. She folded it neatly and tucked it into her pillow. That night she said nothing during dinner. She did not brush her horse. She lay still for hours, because surviving too well felt like betrayal. They weren't supposed to eat bread. They weren't supposed to laugh at soap or learn how to mount a horse or sing along to a harmonica. Their very survival, intact, fed, even thriving, had become evidence of failure in the eyes of a nation that only valued death over disgrace. And yet, each morning, they woke. They stretched their legs. They whispered greetings to the animals. They wrote more letters. They existed, and that quiet existence, in its defiance, in its confusion, became its own kind of resistance. A resistance not just to empire or enemy, but to the lies they had once believed about themselves, because somewhere between two worlds, between shame and healing, between silence and song, a new self was waiting to be born. It was a morning like any other. The sun rose slow and golden over the fences, the horses snorted in their pens, and the women were sweeping the barracks when a jeep pulled up, stirring dust in its wake. A soldier jumped out, holding a sheet of paper high in the air, waving to the camp commander. No one paid it much attention at first. There was always some new rule, some new form, some new delay. But then someone whispered, "It's over." The word spread fast, but not like fire. More like fog, thick, slow, uncertain. Japan has surrendered. The women froze. Brooms stopped mid-sweep. A feed bucket clattered to the ground. One girl dropped to her knees, eyes wide but unseeing. Another sat down, hard, on the edge of the trough. No one cheered, no one cried. There was no music, no embraces, only silence, the deep, hollow kind that falls when something enormous has ended and you're still standing. The empire had fallen, and now, for the first time in years, they were free. But the word felt wrong in their mouths, because freedom was no longer the escape they had dreamed of. It was a question. Where would they go? Who would take them? What were they returning to? They had once been symbols of sacrifice, tools of morale, sanctioned and shamed all at once. Now they were ghosts, the war's leftovers. Their families might not want them. Their country might deny them. There would be no medals, no thanks. Only quiet shame in rice-paper homes and the silent judgment of neighbors who'd never known what it meant to serve without choice. Some women begged to stay. "Let us keep feeding the horses," they said. "Let us sweep the stables, just a little longer." Others spoke of faking illness, of hiding until the next transport left without them. A few began packing their small belongings with numb hands, folding letters and tucking bars of soap into their sleeves like talismans against what waited beyond the ocean. And through it all, Callahan was quiet. He didn't say much when the news broke. He kept doing what he always did, brushing down the horses, fixing the fence posts, offering bread and nods instead of speeches. But the women watched him differently now. Every moment felt final, every glance, every shared silence in the stables, every note from his battered harmonica. On the day the trucks arrived for repatriation, the women lined up beside their suitcases, most of them cobbled together from scrap wood and rope. The gate stood open for the first time in months. Callahan walked down the row slowly, nodding to each woman, touching the brim of his hat. When he reached Aki, she looked up and whispered, "Thank you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle, a coil of braided horsehair tied with a thin strip of red cloth. He placed it in her hands. "For luck," he said. She blinked fast, holding back tears. She was not the only one. No speeches were made, no cameras waited, just engines starting, wheels turning, fences shrinking behind them, the land of the enemy fading into memory. But for the women, the real war was only beginning, not with guns or bombs, but with silence, with shame, with the terrifying work of remembering who they had been before the uniforms, before the camps, before they were told their worth was tied to sacrifice. They left as survivors, but they returned as strangers, and in time most of them would never speak of the camp again, except for a few. A handful of women who kept their letters, their harmonica tunes, their soap, and the memory of a cowboy who asked them once if they could ride a horse. And somehow that question still echoed louder than all the others. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like this video if you want more stories like this one. The ship docked under a gray sky, and no one cheered. The women stood at the rail, holding bags too small for the weight they carried, staring at the shape of Japan rising out of the mist. It looked familiar, but wrong. The mountains were still there, the curve of the coastline unchanged, but the silence that greeted them was not the quiet of peace. It was absence. Cities gutted by firebombs, streets crowded with makeshift shelters, ration lines longer than memory. Home had become a place of ghosts. They stepped off the boat and into a country that no longer had room for them. Their names weren't listed, their stories weren't welcome. Some were met by distant cousins or old neighbors who didn't ask questions and didn't offer embraces either. Others walked alone through cities they once knew, now hollowed out by war and suspicion. One woman returned to her family's village to find the house a charred shell and her surname whispered like a curse. "You should have died," someone muttered. "That would have been easier." There was no ceremony, no thanks, only silence. So they adapted. They folded into the background. They changed their names, their dialects, their mannerisms. They said as little as possible. Some told families they'd been nurses. Others claimed they were lost in evacuation. A few tried to speak the truth, but found no one ready to hear it. One woman, Noriko, confessed her history to her older brother. He stared at her, eyes dry, and said, "That's not who we are. Don't say it again." So she didn't. Because silence, in post-war Japan, was not just survival. It was obedience rebranded. Grief had to be tidy. Pain had to be honorable. And there was no room in that tidy grief for women who had lived through mercy, who had laughed inside barbed wire, who had been touched with kindness by the enemy. They locked the memories away. Deep. Some married, some vanished into cities, some took jobs in places where no one asked for history. But the past did not stay buried. It leaked out in dreams, in moments of stillness, in the strange ache that came every time a harmonica played in the distance or a horse neighed in a passing field. Some women confessed years later to hearing American songs in their heads and not knowing whether to smile or cry. Because kindness, as it turned out, was harder to carry than cruelty. The whip they could have understood, the hunger, the assault, the violence, these were the weapons they had been taught to expect. But the mercy, the soap, the laughter over spilled buckets, and the absurd gift of a horsehair braid tied with a red ribbon, that stayed with them in ways they couldn't explain. It made them question who they were, what they believed, and what had been stolen from them, not just by the war, but by the silence that followed. One woman, long after the war, kept her soap bar in a wooden box, wrapped in cloth. She never used it. She only opened the box on quiet, nights when the world had gone still, and pressed the faint lavender scent to her face. It was a memory of captivity, yes, but also of dignity, of something given freely, something undeserved. That contradiction haunted them more than fences ever did. They had returned home, but they were not the same, and in a country that demanded silence, the truth became their most dangerous possession. But memory has a way of slipping through cracks, like sunlight through broken shutters. Decades passed, names changed, faces wrinkled. The war faded into textbooks and ceremonies, and the women who had once been girls in American prison camps became grandmothers, caretakers, strangers even to themselves. Some carried on without ever telling a soul. Others whispered fragments late at night to trusted friends or wide-eyed daughters who couldn't quite believe the stories were real. And among those fragments, one detail returned again and again: the horse. Not the bombs, not the interrogations, not the surrender, but the horse. The scent of saddle leather, the feel of reins in their hands, the sway of the animal beneath them. For some, it was the first time in their lives that something obeyed their direction. Not a superior officer, not a command, but a living creature responding to their touch. One woman, well into her 70s, recalled it during an interview. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with wonder. "He asked if I could ride," she said. "Like I mattered, like I was someone who could say yes." It had felt absurd at the time. A cowboy in the jungle, horses behind barbed wire. But that absurdity carved open space for something real. Callahan hadn't meant to change lives, he'd just done what felt right. A Texas man with dust in his boots and stories in his drawl, who believed that horses taught dignity because no one could fake stillness in a saddle. And when he handed the reins to those women, what he gave wasn't just trust, it was permission. Permission to exist outside their assigned role, permission to be more than a tool of empire or a ghost of war, a single act, a simple question. Can you ride? And with it, the foundation of everything they had been taught began to shake. Years later, when they were asked what they remembered most, not many spoke of the uniformed guards, or the barracks, or the cold meals. They spoke of riding, of falling, laughing, trying again, of feeding apples to horses and singing off-key to country tunes they didn't understand, and they remembered the silence that followed, not oppressive, but open, like breath after drowning, because that's what dignity does. It stays, even when you can't speak of it, even when shame tries to cover it. Once you've tasted it, even once, it lingers, beneath the years, beneath the sorrow, beneath the silence. Some of the women wrote memoirs under pseudonyms. Some gave interviews, quietly, to historians who promised to protect their identities. Others never spoke again, but kept a scrap of saddle leather, a harmonica tune, a bar of soap, each token a thread in the story they lived and the one the world nearly forgot. But stories like this, they don't belong to governments, not to uniforms, not to silence. They belong to memory, to the soft defiance of a smile behind fences, to the absurdity of joy in a place designed for despair, to a cowboy who asked a question and never understood the revolution he sparked, and to the women who carried that question with them across oceans, across decades, across the ruins of empire, and never let it go. Because some truths don't need permission to survive. Some truths ride on. Did this story move you? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like the video if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered.